Hello friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And we're in an important and a dense passage today in our journey through the Scriptures. We're going to cover, I trust and hope, all of Numbers chapter 19. And I've called today's talk, Practicing Discernment. Now, if someone told you that you should practice what is called discernment, you might instinctively think, well, is there something wrong about that? Should we not be people who don't discriminate? But what if I told you the Bible does in fact encourage such things? And that's the subject, I believe, of this chapter of the book of Numbers. Discernment, discrimination, what it is, and how we should practice it. Now, in the Old Testament, the Lord emphasized the importance of being a discriminating person. He talks about us making a distinction, primarily between clean and unclean things, which essentially, I suppose, means discriminating, doesn't it? Now, I'm using the term in the positive sense here, not within the negative context of race or gender, but there are times when you should discriminate, in other words, discern between that which is right and wrong, and that which is clean and unclean, that which is sinful and that which is not so. And this concept arises here specifically in the book of Numbers, in this chapter 19. But before I dive in and look at it, I'd like to briefly review what has happened up to this point, because it's crucial in our understanding of this chapter before we approach it. We know that after leaving Egypt, the Israelites spent about a year in Sinai. They then journeyed towards the Promised Land, halted at this place called Kadesh Barnea. The Lord wanted them and was prepared for them to enter the land, but they hesitated and they asked the Lord for permission, and he agreed that they could send in 12 spies. And that's what we actually looked at yesterday. Now, the majority of the spies returned and reported, they said the land was beautiful, bountiful, land of milk and of honey, but they also reported that there were giants in the land, leading to the decision not to proceed. However, this decision displeased the Lord, who decreed that current generation would in fact wander in the wilderness until their demise, until they'd all died out. Now, the lesson here is a massive one, being that sometimes the Lord will allow you to follow your desires, your decisions, even if they lead to dire consequences. And so we will see they wander in the land. Often people say 40 years, but that's the whole period of the journey in the wandering. They're actually going to wander around aimlessly for about 38 plus years, during which approximately, at very least, 600,000 people will die off, amounting to around 40 deaths per day. Think about that. The large number of deaths will pose problems, because we know already under the Levitical law, touching a dead body renders someone ceremonially unclean. And it is this issue and these things that this chapter will address for us. The issue of becoming unclean and the managing of how to dispose of and account for ceremonially, spiritually, all these dead bodies. You see, in Numbers in this chapter 19 verse 11, it equivocally tells us that he who touches a dead body or anyone else in proximity with it is unclean for this period of 7 days. These verses, along with the other Old Testament verses that say the same thing, are pivotal in our understanding of this entire chapter. Because now you can approach it and see that it actually is all revolving around the concept of how to manage the dead and the touching of the dead bodies. Now, the chapter as a whole can be divided into roughly 2 parts. The first part will deal with the preparation for the purification ceremonies around this, while the latter second half and longer part describes the purification rituals themselves. Following these events, the handling of a dead body, the touching of a dead body, that which has created ceremonial defilement. But I'm sure the thing that's screaming out to you, the question that's screaming out of your head is, what can we learn from this chapter today? Well, not surprisingly, I'm going to suggest that there are several important and intriguing insights that emerge from this chapter, and that's what we're going to look at today. particularly in relation to this atonement of the situation, utilizing what is referred to as the red heifer. That's what we're going to dive into today. So welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, let's begin with a look at the passage. And we're going to start in verse 1, and I'm going to read the first 10 verses for you, which say this. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the requirement of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the Israelites to bring you a red heifer without defect or blemish that has never been under a yoke. Give it to Eleazar the priest, and it is to be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. Then Eleazar the priest is to take some of its blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times towards the front of the tent of meeting. While he watches the red heifer, it is to be burned, its hide, flesh, blood, and intestines. The priest is to take some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool and throw them onto the burning heifer. After that, the priest must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. He may then come into the camp, but he will be ceremonially unclean until evening. The man who burns it must also wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he too will be unclean till the evening. A man who is unclean shall gather up all the ashes of the heifer and put them in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp. They are to be kept by the Israelite community for use in the water of cleansing. It is for the purification from sin. The man who gathers up the ashes of the heifer must also wash his clothes, and he too will be unclean till evening. This will be a lasting ordinance, both for the Israelites and for the foreigners residing among them." Okay. That's the text. Let me try and break down this first part of the chapter for you, which focuses on the preparation, doesn't it, for the ceremony of the red heifer. Now, some of what I've discussed today is pretty straightforward. It is the underlying principle that if you touch a dead body, you've become ceremonially unclean, and you need to undergo this ritual of what is the burning of the red heifer. So if we just quickly revisit these verses, I'd like to highlight a few key points for you. The first 2 verses simply instruct the children of Israel to bring a red heifer, one without blemish, defect-free, but also one that has never been subject to yoke. In other words, has never been used for work in the fields. So this sets the specification for the chosen animal. Moving on then, verse 3 indicates that the person who has touched the dead body must take the red heifer and take it to Eleazar the priest. Then both of them, that's he and Eleazar, must then go outside the camp. And it is outside the camp that there the red heifer is to be slaughtered, and Eleazar then takes some of its blood back to the tabernacle to sprinkle it. Now verse 5 specified that the heifer is then to be burned, and it also says along with its hide, its flesh and blood. Other scriptures suggest that even its dung is to be used as fuel for the fire, and the priest then adds to that cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool. Now, it's worth noting that some Bible teachers try to make everything symbolic in the interpretation of all that's going on here, including these 3 elements that are added to the fire. I have to say that it's essential to approach such interpretations with a degree of caution, as some people can go down a bit of a rabbit hole and things can become, well, how can I say it, highly speculative. Nevertheless, it's worth noting, and we shouldn't miss the fact, that these 3 elements, cedar wood was known for its durability, hyssop was linked to purification, and scarlet wool is seen to represent the blood. And these are often seen as the 3 symbols that together make up the entirety of a human life. Now, the second part of the preparation concerns the individuals that are going to be involved in all this. Verse 7 and 8 outline the priest's action, while verse 9 focuses on the one who committed the sin themselves. The priest is seen to be required to wash his clothes, bathe in water, and even after doing that, he remains unclean until that evening. Similarly, the one who burns the heifer must also wash his clothes, bathe, and remain unclean until evening. Verse 9 then introduced a rather intriguing twist to the story. A clean man is instructed to gather the ashes of the heifer and store them outside the camp in a designated clean place. These ashes are then to be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel to be added to create a water of purification for the removal of sin. This practice of storing the ashes outside the camp allows others who have touched a dead body to use them for purification without having to go through the entirety of this longer ritual. This itself is declared to be an everlasting ordinance that symbolically strengthens the life of the living Israelites and removes the uncleanliness caused by repeated contact with the dead. And finally, closing this section, verse 10 emphasizes that this statute is to be observed forever. This is again something that is going to be of perpetual, ongoing significance within the nation of Israel. Okay, that was just sort of an introduction and a preparation for all of this that they're going to go through in the form of the purification itself. Well, that's described for us starting in verse 11. Whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. They must purify themselves with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, then they will be clean. But if they do not purify themselves on the 3rd and the 7th days, they will not be clean. If they fail to purify themselves after touching a human corpse, they defile the Lord's tabernacle. They must be cut off from Israel. Because the water of cleansing has been sprinkled on them, they are unclean. Their cleanliness remains on them. This is the law that applies when a person dies in a tent. Anyone who enters the tent and anyone who is in it will be unclean for 7 days. And every open container without a lid fastened on it will also be unclean. Pausing there at verse 16. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in such a closely knit community as this, where 40 people, remember, are probably dying every day, someone, of course, had to take care of the bodies. And it could happen that one might accidentally touch a dead body, and in such cases, of course, that person becomes ceremonially unclean. But remember, this isn't about moral law. This is about illustrating God's distinction between clean and unclean things when it comes to making atonement through ritual law, religious law. So if someone touches a body, they are unclean for 7 days on that basis. The purpose wasn't to remove sin on people in that sense, but to address this issue described as uncleanliness associated with death due to death's connection with sin. The wages of sin is death and all that stuff. Now, in the rest of the passage, we're going to get more detailed instructions than what have been outlined for us in this initial part of how this is going to happen. For instance, in verse 12, it stated that the person must purify themselves with water on the 3rd and then again on the 7th day in order to become clean. And failure to do it exactly in that way means that they would remain unclean. But verse 13 introduced an additional interesting point. Failure to purify oneself after touching a dead body means that if that person is in the tabernacle area, that defiles the tabernacle itself. So this underscores the whole interconnectedness between the individual accidents and the sanctity of where the community are represented and people draw together in the meeting place of the Lord, particularly the Levites, of course. And this penalty for this offense is indeed severe. Now, the cutting off from Israel is interpreted at least to mean excommunications, but there are some who suggest that it is even perhaps referring to death. Moving on, the law is further specified regarding what happens when a person dies in a tent in verse 14. In such a case, not only the person who touched the dead body has become unclean, but everything in the tent at that time, and anyone who entered the tent during that time are declared ceremonially unclean. Additionally, even uncovered vessels in the tent are considered unclean along with their contents. So this passage is going deeper into the specifics, highlighting the consequences of coming into contact with death and the vital importance of maintaining both societal cleanliness and ceremonial purity among the people. Some other cases are now going to be described for us in verses 16 through to 20, which tells us this. Anyone out in the open who touches someone who has been killed with a sword, or someone who has died a natural death, or anyone who touches a human bone or a grave, will be unclean for 7 days. For the unclean person, put some ashes from the burnt purification offering into a jar, and pour fresh water over them. Then a man who is ceremonially clean is to take some hyssop, dip it in the water, and sprinkle the tent, and all the furnishings, and the people who were there. He must also sprinkle anyone who has touched a human bone, or a grave, or anyone who has been killed, even if they've died a natural death. The man who is clean is to sprinkle those who are unclean on the 3rd and the 7th day, and on the 7th day he is to purify them. Those who are being cleansed must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and that evening they will be clean. But if those who are unclean do not purify themselves, they must be cut off from the community, because they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. The water of cleansing has not been sprinkled on them, and they are unclean. This is a lasting ordinance for them. The man who sprinkles the water of the cleansing must also wash his clothes, and anyone who touches the water of cleansing will remain unclean until evening. Anything that an unclean person touches becomes unclean, and anyone who touches it becomes unclean until evening. Now, in the first set of verses that I read for you a little back, verses 14 through 15, 16, it discusses and describes what happens if someone dies in their tent. But here, from verse 16 onward, it covers a scenario of someone dying outside, in a field perhaps. And this, of course, covers many situations, possibly including war, but not exclusively all forms of death outside. In any of these cases, if someone touches a dead body, they're again unclean for 7 days. And again, the procedure for what to do is outlined in detail in the following verses. This unclean person should take ashes from the heifer that we heard about being burned for purification, and then he's to take running water from a running water source, and he's to pour over the ashes contained within a vessel. A clean person then dips hyssop into the mixture, which is a small branch, and sprinkles it on the tent and the vessels and people present, including anyone who touched the dead body, even if someone just stumbled upon a human bone, someone who had perhaps died a long time ago, or even a grave. Verse 18 then explains the actions of the clean person who is to perform this sprinkling ritual, and how they are to do it on the 3rd and the 7th days, same as before. Afterwards, the clean person then must wash their clothes and bathe, and they actually don't become clean until that evening. And then there's the warning that failure to go through this process perfectly results in that person being cut off from the community, because the sanctuary of the Lord is being defiled. This statue is again described as a permanent thing, emphasizing the importance of ongoing maintenance of purity within the nation of Israel. And the final verse of that section reiterates for us that anything touched by any unclean person immediately itself becomes clean until evening, illustrating the strictness of this law. So the message here is very clear, isn't it? At all times, it's avoid contact with dead bodies at all costs. Now, in Numbers 31, we will be told that the ashes of the red heifer were considered a consecration, possessing the essential properties of what was required to make a sin offering. As a fascinating aside, I read just recently about how today, as we speak, Orthodox Jews are preparing for the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which of course currently holds a Muslim mosque sitting on the site. These Jews have reportedly gathered all the necessary items to restore temple service, including the clothing, the furniture, but they've even bred red heifers to ensure the availability of these ashes required for the purification rituals when the temple is re-established. This is proactive preparation going on today, and I think the very least we can say is it underscores the significance attached to the red heifer in Jewish tradition. Now, moving beyond the historical narrative, some interpret this chapter, along with its other dietary laws, as having potential medical significance. Now, while the symbolic nature of these laws is clear, there is a debate about whether they might also have practical health benefits. Things like circumcision, medical people say, well, on the 8th day of a male child's life, which is how it's mandated in the Bible, and circumcision should be done on a male child, we now know medical people and scientists will tell us that coincides with a peak in a certain blood clotting agent called factor K. This observation was made to me many years ago by a Christian doctor who said he actually became a Christian during his medical training. And this highlights for me one of the instances where clearly Bible guidelines align with our medical understandings that have come along much later, which at least suggests a really deep wisdom embedded in these ancient texts. I know of people who are in the butchery trade who have been convinced during their training of the truth of the Bible and the Old Testament laws by their understanding the dietary rules and what was and was not appropriate to eat for a community wandering in the wilderness without the ability of refrigeration or ways of keeping food clean. Others have pointed out that God understood before we did that the typical incubation period for bacterial diseases is often within 7 days, and that aligns with what is being taught here about the handling of dead bodies. This is a perfect alignment with the provisions offered and required in Numbers chapter 19 about a dead person not touching a dead body and how they, if they have to be considered unclean for 7 days. Because on top of that, of course, proper hygiene practices had to be carried out, such as hand washing, clothes washing, and thorough drying. They're all prescribed here in the Levitical law, which certainly, at the very least, would have been effective in reducing the spread of harmful microbes. And the requirement for sprinkling running water also, of course, we know today has significance from a hygienic point of view. It's known that water that is left sitting and can become stagnant and thereby can harbour microbes, whereas running water, if that's the source it's drawn from, is much less likely to do so. So again, the use of running water for these purification rituals may have had benefits which the people at the time didn't understand, but we know today would have significantly reduced the transmission of diseases. So considering all these types of insights, isn't it intriguing to think about how the ancient Israelites, guided by these archaic laws, may unknowingly have been following principles that have contributed to our modern concept of hygiene and disease prevention? They may not have understood or known anything about microbes and all those aspects of things, but these practices and the wisdoms of these laws is evident today to us in their effectiveness for preventing infection and disease. For me, it's fascinating to see how these ancient biblical customs in effect align with our most recent scientific understanding. For me, it offers a deeper appreciation of the wisdom encoded in the text, and it causes me to wonder what may be in here that we don't yet understand yet. Now, to get back to the main ideas behind the text, there is the notion of discernment going on here, even discrimination, some might say, and approached from this way, these types of rules and regulations and areas of discernment and discrimination we need to express in our religious life choices, well, they can take on a different meaning if we understand the context in this passage. Here it is about the ability to distinguish between what is clean and what is unclean, to discriminate between those two things, especially here, specifically where it pertains to the matter of life and death. God's intention to discriminate in this way and in this sense now can seem to extend way beyond just the rituals involved here. It's about physical cleanliness being linked to spiritual discernments. And it's, I think, from a New Testament point of view, it's meant to prompt us to consider what we should discriminate against, what things we should encourage ourselves and others to do, and what things are potentially unclean, harmful to us spiritually as well as physically. Now, a modern-day parallel could perhaps be found in the rather obvious thing of saying we should discriminate against the overuse of alcohol and drug abuse, of course, calling things like cocaine or heroin for what they are, dangerous in nature. Because we know, despite even the well-known risks and the tragic stories of overdose, many individuals still lack the discernment to avoid such choices and abuse substances that are dangerous like these. In considering the lack of discernment displayed in certain situations, it's clear to me that individuals left to their own devices without a clear set of guidelines and a wall, a hedge around things, they fail to heed the most obvious warnings. But friends, it's not all about the dramatic and obvious things like drugs and alcohol. That probably puts us in a position we're in danger of judging other people and not looking internally to what it should mean for us. This passage for me underscores the necessity of discernment in our everyday decision making. Common sense, one might call it. Someone once joked, common sense isn't so common these days, is it? Common sense aligned with spiritual discernment is meant to serve as cautionary warnings, reminders of the importance of exercising discernment, discrimination in all aspects of life, particularly the spiritual. Now, what would the New Testament say about this lack of discernment? So if we want to seek wisdom from the teaching of the New Testament, the first place we go to seek insight on anything to do with Levitical laws is Hebrews. And in this case, it's going to be Hebrews chapter 9, because it explores the whole issue, specifically referring back to this passage in Numbers chapter 19. So listen to what it has to say about these things. Hebrews 9, beginning in verse 8. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place has not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshipper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands, that is to say, is not part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. But how much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our conscience from all acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. Now, what the writer to the Hebrews is doing in this passage is simply this. He's saying at that time that there were Jews who had become Christians, and they were now contemplating going back to Judaism. And he is writing to them and saying, look at all that stuff in the Old Testament. Then he goes through the litany of the things: the blood of bulls, the goats, the ashes, the sprinkling of things, and the sprinkling of the unclean. And he says that didn't do the job, did it? Not eternally anyway. It only dealt with sin and uncleanliness, death by death, sin by sin, day by day. But he says, look, now the blood of Christ is offered without spot to God and cleanses you and your conscience from all unrighteousness. All unrighteousness. He said that other stuff couldn't make you perfect, but he says the blood of Christ can purge you, deal with permanently your conscience and your sin entirely and eternally. So here's the crux, friend. The blood of Christ washes all our sins. When we openly admit our wrong, God, who is always faithful and just, forgives us and purifies us from all unrighteousness. But here's the incredible news. In order to do that, we don't need any of this stuff. We don't need a red heifer. We don't need ashes. We don't even need a priest sprinkling holy water, because we have the blood of Christ. We confess our sins, which simply means we acknowledge them, not just our individual sins, but our sinful state, and then we are cleansed. Listen to this verse again. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Did you catch that? It's not about confessing every individual sin you've ever committed and make sure you've covered them all off. It's about living in the perspective of knowing that you should always be in the habit of confessing and, more importantly, acknowledging your faults, your sinful state before God. And that's how you are purified from all unrighteousness. But wait, there's even more. It's not just about forgiveness. It's about living with a clear conscience. When you've sinned and you confess it, you don't need to carry the guilt around anymore of those things. The blood of Christ cleanses your conscience. But it doesn't do that to say you can now go back to sinning. It does that to put you in a state, to take you out of the state of sin and put you in a state where you are able to serve the living God. Remember Hebrews 9:14, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offer himself without blemish to God, and purify our conscience from dead works, to serve the living God. So, my friends, that is the real lesson behind the red heifer, New Testament style. We can thank God for the blood now of his Son, because it is that which cleanses us for all sin. And we can thank him for giving us the ability to serve him with a clear conscience, not because we're perfect, not because we're never tempted, but because the blood of sin has purified us eternally. And that, my friends, is the power of Jesus' sacrifice, and that is something that we can be thankful for every day. Thanks for joining me today. Okay, that was great. Thanks for being with me today. I do hope you're enjoying being on this journey through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. We'll pick up in the book of Numbers exactly where we left off today. I do hope you can join me. If you're new to this, please consider subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. It's always free, freely available. New episodes Monday to Friday, with occasional bonus episodes and little episodes sometimes at the weekend. And by doing that, you have made the decision to make the study of the Bible part of your daily life. And I believe absolutely that God will bless you by doing that. He's certainly blessing me in the preparation of it. There's always an episode notes page and a full transcript of everything I say available in the episode notes page. But if you're not seeing those episode notes where you get your podcast from, just visit us on the Bible Project homepage, which is the Bible Project at buzzsprout.com, and there you'll find active links to all the places you can connect and support this ministry. So thanks for being with me today. I do trust I'll see you back here again tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.